My name is Zoe Sperling, and I'm a senior director here at Hauser and Wirth in London. On behalf of the presidents and the partners, we are thrilled to welcome you this evening in celebration of our opening exhibitions of 2022. This is a very special moment for Ed Clark's work, as unbelievably, it's his first solo exhibition in the UK. The exhibition explores a critical tension in Clark's work between the meticulously painted oval and integrated oval works of the 70s and the loose, gestural Broken Rainbow series, which began in the early 80s and continued through the 90s. We extend a very special thank you to Malenka Clark, Ed Clark's daughter, and her husband, Modi Ture, who are honored to have with us here this evening. An enormous thank you to Madeline Warren, our senior director in New York, who's also here with us tonight. I am thrilled to introduce you to our guest speakers this evening, Dr. Zoé Whitley, director of Chisenhale Gallery, and Dr. Mark Godfrey, critic, historian, and curator, who together curated the landmark touring exhibition, Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, 1963 to 1983, which included Clark's phenomenal 1970 work, Yenan No. 9. And without further ado, I give you Mark and Zoe.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Thanks everyone for being here. We've got a great turnout, and it feels special to be, back. We used to do this all the time for years and years, so it's nice to be back. We want to keep this as informal as a seated gathering of many people can allow. And so I think to start, it seems right to summon, we're in this beautiful, pristine space in which the works are beautifully hung. But for those of you who ever have the privilege of being in an artist's studio, it's a very different matter. And I think that it might help to set the scene for how these works came into being, to read you something. And this is a description by artist Jack Whitten, who we're very close to, in the studio with Mr. Ed Clark. Looking at Ed's studio floor, it is some sort of physical memory of every painting that has been done. I can see the paint spills. It's what we call the tracks. And in his studio, the tracks of the paintings are on the floor. You can get an idea of the process that he uses. Obviously, a lot of fluid pigment was used in the process. The floor is totally covered in paint. And it's not the whole floor. It appears to be a platform of some sort. I would say it probably measures 14 feet square. So all of the activity takes place down on this plywood platform. The buildup of paint is quite amazing. There's a plastic sheet covering the floor. I'm looking at blacks, pinks, reds, blues, a whole range of grays. The blues become gray. Some of them become bright. In truth, it's like sitting on an artist's palette. Some of the paintings are very dry, obviously done with dry pigment. Some are totally wet, have a real nice wet look, very sensual. I'm looking at one facing me right now. It's a bright pink, probably one of the brightest pink paintings that I've ever seen in my years of viewing paintings. Very sensual. I mean, downright sexy. Some delicate grays toward the centers, some blue grays, some dirty whites, some dirty grays, dirty blues, but the whole painting has an intense, sensual quality to it. And then he goes on to say, which makes me think, we haven't yet talked about Ed the painter in terms of his ideas, but we're getting there. Bear with us. And I feel like that's the place to start and what we'll try to do this evening.
It's a great, powerful description by Jack Whitten, and I was lucky enough to be there in 2016. So just to sort of set the scene a bit more, that studio was in a loft on, I think, 15th Street, 22nd Street, but just off 5th Avenue, so sort of Midtown New York. You got to the top and there was Ed, and he was still painting. He was into his 90s by then, but there was, exactly as Jack Whitten describes, paint everywhere on the floor, lots of canvases, and it stacked up against the side of the walls, and it was really a life of painting. But we're going to talk about some of the places that he had been in. The idea of laying the canvas out on the floor kind of takes us back to Pollock in a way, Jack Whitten in another way. But actually at the time of Pollock's emergence, Ed Clark went to live in Paris for the first time and spent much of the early and mid-50s there. And I think we should probably start by, from time to time we'll read out some quotes of his, but like one question is why did he move to Paris at that point? What was happening there, and why was it a milieu that he wanted to be part of?
Do you want me to answer, or do you want me to bring his voice into it?
Either.
Or we can do both. Well, I think if we start with the kind of the general, and then we go small, I think there's a very interesting thrust to think about in terms of the possibilities that Paris presented to African American artists in particular, and that's visual artists, but also musicians, as a place where some of the kind of frankly racist limitations placed upon their prospects, their daily lives in the United States were just a little bit looser. And that isn't to say that racism doesn't exist in Paris or anywhere else, but there was this way in which there was an opening up, and the historian Houston Baker speaks about it in a way that I think is really helpful, because it helps us understand that we can think about both the aesthetic context, but also the autobiographical context, and the way in which a place like Paris might present a possibility where you can actually define yourself, redefine yourself. You're not only having to respond in relation to being defined, and that's one of the things that comes across in many of Mr. Clark's recollections about his time in Paris, and the response to the work being so much about people engaging with the work and not necessarily his background or who he was, but really wanting to say, okay, I accept you as an artist and I want to understand what's happening in the work. So that, as a frame, I think becomes very important.
He says at some point, I think, that American artists were looked down upon in Paris, and among art critics, but he was looked down upon for being American, not for being a black American. So, it was just all Americans were thought of as not that good. But he obviously had opportunities there. But then there were kind of great artists that he looked up to. He talks a lot about Nicholas de Stael and others. Later on, he got to know Joan Mitchell. But the painting "The City."
It's painted in 1953.
1953, which is a real breakthrough for him, because being in Paris allowed him to kind of break with the figurative painting that he made in Chicago before and start painting abstractly. They were all into jazz. I guess American jazz and European jazz was very prominent in Paris in the 50s. And there's a quote, because a lot of the time the question is, what's the relationship of jazz to abstraction? And he says, it's not just a coincidence that bebop, highly improvisational music, came out around the same time American painters were exploring abstraction in an expressionistic way. I know Franz Klein painted with music. Personally, I'm into the music of Miles Davis and Charlie Parker. And I just wondered, do you think there's kind of connections to be made between improvisational jazz and what he was doing?
I think so. I'm more interested, I guess, rather than kind of anchoring it to specific musicians, where we would have to ask him and then take that and be like, well, yeah, I hear it because you've said it, or then you've seen it. But to also think about the way in which artists at the time were really exploring, well, what Frank Bolling's always referred to as the possibilities of paint. And when Jack Whitten and Ed Clark spoke at length about what happens on the canvas or on the sheet of paper, I think there's this beautiful simultaneity, or this duality between what they refer to as pushing the paint around, but then also effectively being pushed around by the paint. You know, they often talk about like paintings making themselves, and there are a number of paintings of Mr. Clark's, particularly from this period, that he's referred to as making themselves. So then I see in that work very much this kind of parallel with improvising or the jam sessions that might happen sonically, and then what's happening visually. And then that starts to evolve in other ways in the later works by the incorporation of, say, boiling water, and then seeing what the paint does as it starts to disperse or, to become more diffuse. So that, I think, is a very interesting way to think about a relationship between a practice that is, and that's the thing, it's not just intuitive. There's so much skill involved. So I never want to take away from that in talking about the improvised, because it takes time, you know, for these great jazz musicians to be able to do that on the spot and to come up with something. So I think that the work involved that then allows for the kind of the creativity and the intuition to happen, where works make themselves, or as we know, Mr. Clark destroyed a great number of his works that he felt weren't working, or some that he thought after the fact, I wish I'd held on to that. So I think just understanding that within this process there's a kind of both a letting go, but then also a kind of pulling back that I think is interesting.
And I think there's one painting that I want to just show an image of, just because I think it's an important, like to anchor the history. And I think it is a good example of, you know, improvising and making painting. It's the painting, this one. And
it's Untitled.
It's famous because it was now in the Art Institute of Chicago's collection. And it was made in 1957, and it was shown in downtown New York at the Bratter Gallery, which was a sort of artist co-op that he was part of. And it was shown when he returned from Paris after his first time in Paris. And it has gone down as being the first shaped canvas in American art, and leads therefore to other ideas of the shaped canvas that he develops that we'll come to in a bit. But it's important, I think, just to sort of mention that that was for him a landmark painting. The idea of improvising and going beyond a rectangle. And of course it was sort of, there was a reception, but he didn't get the reception that he deserved for such an innovation with the language of abstraction, because of, you know, racism in American art reception, not looking as much at his work as, you know, 2 years later, Frank Stella, or 3 years later, Frank Stella began to use shaped canvases. But the other big innovation that I think we should talk about a bit more, because we can see it here, is the decision not to use a paintbrush but a broom.
But before we do that, I think because you've spoken about this particular work, precisely where we started, on the floor in the studio, is where this happened. And we're starting with a very formal conception of how a composition might emerge. Then something that wasn't working as a result of there being papers on aspects of the canvas. It wasn't just like, oh, that's good enough. There's then an intention that kind of accompanies the improvisation. And so to make that particular work, the fact that it was then built up with layers of paint and then supported on the back as well, I think something about understanding the structure of how it came to be just really excites me. And it's the fact that it was one of the things that Ed Clark was willing to share, but actually often referring to his work as being beyond language. So even to get to the point where the how is being discussed is often not the most straightforward process. So I think to think about how that would have been received at the time, how many artists would have been in that space, and at the time it would have mostly been fellow artists going to look at the work, and just that sheer moment of how did you do this? What is this made? You know, people wanting to look behind and get into it. I think that there's so much excitement and movement in that work. And then, if we move on to these other ways of thinking about motion and movement in the work, like the work behind us, and otherwise, then we can see this evolution in how he's approaching painting in ways that continue to be original and continue to redefine the kind of the scope of painting in the 20th century.
I think this one was made, it looks like it's made, and some of the paintings at this point are made with brushes and splatters and so on. So at a certain point, I'm not exactly sure when it was, but the broom becomes the main instrument. And there's all sorts of things to say about the broom. And he said, he was asked about the broom. Do you want,
Do we have
we've
a
got
broom
a quote about the broom on the second page.
I can be the reader of the broom quote.
At the top.
And the push broom I began to use a little later gives you another thing, something you cannot do with your wrist. And there's a beautiful film that I encourage everyone to look at where you see how Ed Clark is using his hands in the manipulation of the paint. So I think there is something for us to think about in terms of the gesture and manual labor. You can't use a broom that's wide with your hand, but it won't give you that straight stroke. You have to want that straight stroke. It's like cutting through something really fast. That's what the straight stroke with the push broom gives you, speed. Maybe it's something psychological. It's like cutting through everything. It's also anger, or something like it, to go through it in a big sweep. And the push broom stroke can be straight too. The straight stroke, I really like the idea of risky immediacy. Painting is work. It's like going to work, like being a mechanic.
So, I think it's this idea of using the broom is sort of a very radical thing to do. And one of the interesting things that was said about it subsequently is that it brings together high art, abstract painting, and menial labor. In fact, when David Hammons curated a show of Ed Clark, a New York critic wrote a review of it and talked about janitorial labor. And you see, so you've got the kind of the action of cleaners and workers brought into the language of abstract painting, which is extremely powerful.
I think so, and it's precisely in that distinction that this isn't a domestic broom like we have to sweep up a kitchen, that this is a kind of big, wide push broom that would allow you to cover a great expanse. And so the way of thinking about what it meant to do that, whether in an industrial setting or an educational setting, some kind of municipal building, versus a small space, this idea of covering the expanse, thinking about a monumental canvas, having all of these things come together in a way where so often when we think about theory around precisely the artists of this period, there's a kind of tendency to think of it or kind of relegate it to this purist space and not connect it to real life. So I think there's something important and maybe palpable for people as they get close to the works to understand the grit and the sweat and the work that's involved in the creation of these works.
Yeah, for me, the work's at its absolute best where you've got the subtlety of colour and mixed colour that the broom does, and then the grit. You can't forget it's made by a broom, and sometimes there's sort of trapped hairs in with the paint. Sometimes in the painting from the Paris series that's opposite us, there are parts of the canvas that aren't covered with paint, and you really get a sense of the kind of grit of what's on the floor. But he manages just to achieve this amazing balance between what you started with, the sensuous aspect of colour, and then the grit and the memory of menial labour or janitors. What about the ovals? Should we talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so we had an oval in our show.
We had a painting in Soul of a Nation that was sort of a sister painting to that Untitled one from the same moment as well. And that was another unusual thing that he did to make a painting on an oval.
I think, again, to go back to this notion of constantly innovating and being in conversation with other artists and wanting to think about what it meant to be a painter, what it meant to kind of lay something down on the canvas. There's an interesting way of kind of pushing through the perpendicular boundaries of a rectangular canvas. And again, when pressed, not really wanting to disclose it, but then in being pressed to think about why this shape, what might it mean, thinking that actually there's this bodily connection, you know, the fact that our eyes are closer to ovals than they are to a rectangular shape. So then even in thinking about how we perceive or apprehend the paintings that we're looking at, there's this way of thinking through this different shape as a way to kind of absorb or communicate something that, again, goes beyond language. So he wouldn't want to reduce that to saying, oh, it's the shape of an eye. That's not all of it, but there's something in wanting to move beyond the stretcher, to move beyond the conventions of painting, and to think about what does it mean to not only make a painting, but what does it mean to then, once that painting is finished, to see it.
He also says that it's the shape of the eye, but it's also the shape of the visual field, which I think I understand, that if you were to sort of map what the limit of what we can see is.
What starts to be peripheral and then what you can't even see.
Yeah, it would be, if someone drew, like when the optician says, can you still see it there? But if they did that around, it would be an oval. So when you could come up to his painting, to that one, and have it fill your vision, and there'd be nothing beyond it, and you'd be seeing right to the edges, which I think is beautiful. The first one he called the big egg, so he must have also been thinking about sort of, a new birth of painting in some way. Maybe. By doing that. I don't quite get how he made these ones where he tape out, because, I don't actually understand that. I understand the broom, but to tape out a perfect oval with very, very thin masking tape that you then remove afterwards, can you say anything about that? Or do you know anything about that? So it's a very meticulous process to draw it out, tape it out before removing it.
So I can share a little bit, but most of these pieces I was small when he was making them. But as I recall, he would just drop the, in the center of the piece and then use a string and a pencil.
Like a compass.
I don't know how that masking tape got on there so perfectly once he drew the lines. I don't know that either. But yeah, it was sort of just basic, following it through.
But it is it's interesting because there's the speed that he talks about, and the fact that this is a broom which is used by janitors, but then cutting a sliver of masking tape and laying it down so perfectly and removing it so perfectly is a whole different type of labor and a whole different type of kind of process that's super meticulous that I find really interesting. That big egg, he first showed that when he went back to Paris in the mid-60s, got to know Joan Mitchell, and then came back to New York in the late 60s. And when he got back to New York in the late 60s, he entered a sort of second community of artists. So the first New York community of artists were the people around the Bratter Gallery, people like George Sugarman. But the second group of artists, when he got back from Paris for the second time, were a number of African-American younger abstract painters. And he found himself getting curated into shows with them. And do you want to say something about that group and what it meant to him?
Oh, you've got one of the books, don't you? I was going to say something about the first oval in his own words, because he said, I would try to explain why one should paint ovals. I was thinking, we do not see rectangles. Our eyes are oval-shaped. Why do we do rectangles? Now I'm doing rectangles again. But then I was thinking in 1968, I saw ovals in 1968. People used to say all kinds of things about them. They would say things like, if you turn them like an ellipse, they look celestial. I like what the art critic April Kingsley said in an article. She liked the oval shape because it suggested to her something feminine. But I don't think consciously about any of this. Such associations are unconscious. So I think that that's important, that even as we try to kind of grasp hold of it, there is also just something in the experience and in the making that maybe we can't quite pin down. But yeah, you're right. He's part of this.
Well, yeah, I mean,
group.
so I brought two catalogues, which you can pass around if you'd like, but they are the two shows that he found himself being part of. The first one was done in, and this is so he's come back from Paris, he meets a bunch of younger artists, and there's a huge desire to curate shows of like exclusively black artists. One show happens in Boston, and it was Barry Gaither who curated it, and it was the subject of a huge debate. And
Barry Gaither.
That's where he first showed the big egg.
Do you want me to read the quote out now?
Yeah, you can.
There was a big black show in 1970. So this was Afro-American artists, New York and Boston, at the MFA in Boston. And I was angry. I said nobody would call a show White American Artists, New York and Boston, so I didn't want to be in it. But then it got bigger than me. Pretty soon people who owned my work were putting it in black shows such as this. So the current was too strong, and I found myself in it anyway.
So that was 1970, and then the next year, 1971, there was a show called the Deluxe Show. And this happened in Houston, in a disused cinema, the Deluxe Cinema, and it was curated by Peter Bradley, who was another abstract painter, with some input by Clement Greenberg, and it was black and white artists. And his work was shown, he had Yenham, the work that we had in Soul of a Nation, and it was exhibited with works by Sam Gilliam, by Al Loving,
Larry Rivers, Virginia Jaramillo, lots of
Virginia
people.
Jaramillo, but also Kenneth Noland and so on. And again, you can pass it around if you like, just return it to the front. So that group, he made friends, right, out of that group of younger artists who looked up to him, and Jack was one of them.
Yeah, and I think that even in thinking about beyond the kind of the friendship and the camaraderie that emerged, I think there is something important about what it means to be part of this bigger community. So even when April Kingsley and others start to talk about Ed Clark's very superlative use of the color pink, for instance, I think there's a very kind of interesting parallel in thinking about how artists like Frank Bowling are also using that color, about how Jack Whitten is using it, how he's also thinking about speed and using the developer to pull the paint in one motion across the canvas, at a very large size, using kind of a wooden neoprene structure that he'd built. And then the fact that the support they were able to give one another was also, particularly for Jack, often more than just a kind of theoretical or a kind of artistic competitiveness. It might actually be helping someone like sort their heating out or the electrics and those sorts of things. Being in and out of one another's studios, I think, creates something that, well, I don't know, I find quite enviable, to be in that moment, be like, wow, they were all together. But
It was a very male group, right?
Yeah.
But Howardina Pindell later wrote an essay where she was, or maybe it was an interview, but she was being asked if there was anything in common between the African American abstract artists of that moment. That they had in common that maybe white abstract artists didn't share. It's a controversial question. It's a question that lots of people have wrestled with. But she said it had to do with texture and the sort of flatness or the smoothness that you'd see in a Kenneth Noland or in a Morris Lewis. That was different from the different textures that you got across Ed Clark's work with the broom hairs, or Al Loving's work with when he was cutting up his canvases, or Jack Whitten's work when he was, using a developer. What do you reckon?
I don't want to contradict Howardina Pindell. I know that. I don't know, because I kind of take it back to what the individual artists have said, and I think there's sometimes a sense of also not thinking about where those continuities exist, and the fact that, one of the artists who totally blew Ed Clark's mind when he was in Paris was seeing what Cézanne was doing in terms of flatness and the fact that the background and the foreground could coexist. So I think there's just lots of different ways and registers of addressing the same questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was showing in New York in the early 70s. I mean, Donald Judd showed him in his loft, and he had other gallery shows. So around that point, there was gallery support. I don't know how much collecting of the work, but there were opportunities. And one of the reviewers in Lawrence Campbell in 1972 wrote about the work, and it must have been work of this sort of era, in connection with landscape and landscape qualities. And he said, Clark's paintings are startlingly beautiful, pointing out that the subtlety of the colours, their inner relationships, their groupings and juxtapositions suggest the vastness of the sea when it mirrors the vastness of the sky. And I think it's a kind of open question to what extent these works with these horizontal lines kind of conjure memories of looking at landscapes and so on.
Well, I think he spent a lot of time, I think that was the difference between being in the city, like being in Chicago, and then being in the kind of the outskirts of Paris, and then being in the countryside, and also being, in awe to some extent of being so close to the places where Monet painted, or seeing the same landscape that Cézanne was capturing. And so I think precisely his quote about people responding to the work and seeing something celestial within it, seeing something that's much bigger than the self. I think that certainly the scale of the paintings lend itself to that, but I think that there's also a way of just wanting to be lost in it and to give yourself over to the experience in the way that, comes back to that frequent resistance of wanting to explicate it or to pinpoint it to a point. And so I think by the time we get beyond that 1953 moment where, the city is Paris, that there is this sense of, just an expansiveness in the work and not wanting to close it down. So I can certainly see that kind of horizontality being like the vastness of a landscape. But I think, if Mr. Clark were here with us, I think we'd be hard pressed to get him to say that as well, because then there is that tendency for us to say, okay, it's only this thing, because the artist told us it's only this thing. And so he constantly says it's so much more than any one thing that you can pin on it.
He did travel quite a lot in the 70s. He went to Nigeria in 1973, and then he visited Jack Whitten in Crete, I think in 74 or so, and spent time in New Mexico. And he talked about how all of these experiences of travel left their effect in his color choices. Right. So he said, then I did paintings, and again they looked different, and I realized they had the colors of Africa. That's after he came back from Nigeria. Later, when I went to New Mexico, I did a lot of work and saw that the experience had influenced it unconsciously. It was not just the brushstroke, but also the notion of movement that took on another dimension as I drove across the Southwest. I also noticed the effects of my trip to Brittany. In some of my paintings of that time, obviously resemble the landscape and my experience there. So it's interesting because he says that all these places leave an effect, but it would be hard to pinpoint it, as you say, or to say, okay, that colour means that place.
I feel like that's something so consistent in talking to artists about their work, because that's exactly the kind of thing Frank Bowling has talked about for decades, is a kind of a resistance to someone saying, oh, I see in this a kind of a tropical palette, or these are the colors of Guyana. And then he goes back there and says like, oh, these are those colors. But again, there's something about, I think the most important thing that I find in how the artists talk about these kind of both and rather than either or scenarios is about not not shutting down the readings of the work. So you can't only say, oh, well, this is because it's Crete, or, to make it so kind of legible or a kind of one-to-one correlation, that you don't kind of open it up to these bigger things. And I think that, to me, to go back to where we started, is probably, so much rooted in the fact that I don't think people do that to the same extent with Rothko and other people. There's this way of allowing it to just be expansive and envelop you, and we don't have to kind of close it down and put a cork on it and say it's this one thing.
Yeah, I agree with you to an extent, but I also think it's interesting. Rothko in the 50s and 60s, as far as I know, didn't travel that much. It's a very New York, and Barnett Newman as well. They stay in New York, and their colours come out of commercially available colours in New York. I do think it's interesting to say to what extent did these travels. It's not to pin it down to say that's a painting of the memory of Crete, but I think it's made, the Blue Umber, I think it's made a year after he spends time with Jack Whitten in Crete.
Yeah.
And I think it's, without closing it down, it's an interesting question to say, how does place leave its mark on his sensibility, even if it in unconscious.
It's totally an interesting question to ask, but who gets asked it?
Yeah.
I think it's that thing. I think there's something underneath there about sometimes wanting to to hold something back, because particularly, not that we've gone into it, but in thinking about the definitions of Black art, particularly as they emerged in the 1960s with, Amiri Baraka and others, that if someone's saying these are the parameters, and we also know why those parameters were brought into the fore, because if everything around you is kind of denigrating cultural production, then there's a way of absolutely wanting to uplift that. But at the same time, I think where we allow for something to be purely philosophical or allow it to open up, and where we want to say, oh, I understand this because this happened here on this day. I think that the willingness of, where we, I don't know, maybe it is about a suspension of disbelief or something, but I think that there are, where we ask for narrative and where we're willing to say, this goes so much beyond that, it can't be put into words, I think, are these things that we have to wrestle with. And even where I totally want to know the answers, I am aware that they're asked more in certain contexts than others.
There's one other question I want to ask or talk about before opening it up. It's total speculation, but David Hammons was very in awe of Ed Clark. Probably more wanted to present his work, to curate it more than he was attracted to some of the artists we mentioned before that Ed Clark met in the late 60s. And he made this show at the Tilton Gallery where he'd worked. And I think someone told me that he included an Ed Clark painting in one of his own works, in a drape painting.
Oh, okay.
What do you reckon, it's just a pure speculation, what do you reckon?
Oh, I'm terrible when I don't know the artist. So not knowing either well, I don't know. What do you, I feel like it's a question you want to answer. So regale us with the answer.
No, I think it's that mixture of grace and grit, basically, that you see in Hammons' work as well. That it's the muckiness, it's the grittiness, it's the city, the janitor, the menial labour, and so on, and then the colour chords.
Oh, the janitor and the genius,
yeah.
I think, in one. Yeah.
But it's an interesting one. I mean, it's also interesting when he did that show, he put Kusama and a few other abstract artists in there as well, kind of producing a different context that I guess Ed Clark hadn't been shown next to Kusama, or I can't remember who else was in it, but it was an important curatorial move. Judd, yeah. So, yeah.
I like it. Ed Clark refers to him as Don.
Don.
I'm like, wow. Yeah. So.
Should we take some questions?
If there are some, yeah.
First, I just so appreciate what you're bringing up, and obviously, coming from my experience with Dad, but this last conversation around what does it mean, and I just want to, you're both right in so many ways, and like, is there a right? But I know for Dad on the landscape piece, he appreciated it and acknowledged how it was informing the work. And he actually has a wonderful story. He was in Brazil, is one of the places he went to, and the actual janitor of the studio he had was like, "You're painting the sun." And Dad's like, "I am not painting the sun. I'm just painting." And he's like, "You're painting the sun." And Dad was like, "And you know what?" It obviously informed the work. But he did, to your point, did not want to be pinpointed in that way. And then the separate conversation about how do you read it, this question of being a Black artist and doing the abstract work, he did not want it to be read political, other than that he was bold to do this work, but in a way that didn't need to be read as race. And I don't know if that makes sense, but it was, in some ways, the friction, he felt like in part he was ignored because he wasn't making legibly Black work, and that was the space, the only space that the white world would allow, to the extent it allowed it at all. But also from Amiri Baraka was a friend of his, and it's not like they had a specific falling out, but there was that moment of, if you're not making that work, so it was sort of coming from both sides in terms of that, what he felt to be a limitation. So, sort of all the things.
Yeah.
Yeah, he talks about the white art world wanting Bearden or wanting Jacob Lawrence, because those people can give images, and therefore those are the Black artists who are sort of permitted.
Yeah.
But as you say, it's interesting, when Baraka starts writing, he wants Black artists in 1969 to make legible images as well. So it's so interesting that this type of work is not kind of listened to by either.
Yeah, they're almost about being transported, that the artist is being transported by the experience of colour and paint and scale. That there's a kind of phenomenological quality to them, of speed and dynamism. I mean, they're tremendously active, but controlled. So unlike, say, Pollock or, the whole trope around action painting, you feel like he's just being carried away with the experience of this huge expanse, and also the luminosity of the palette. There's a real sense of light and space and exhilaration. So it was just a kind of comment.
Yeah, he talks a lot about movement. So I think there is definitely something of wanting to capture that, and of kind of moving with the paint, seeing what it does, and that's kind of, a real sense of time. And the way that, to your point, Ivana, about acceleration, there's also moments in various compositions where there's this deceleration as well, or at least the time around you kind of seems to slow. And I think that is, one of the things that feels particularly transporting and kind of distinctive with standing in front of a Clark painting.
I've got one other question, which is for you, actually, which is, again, the painting opposite is called the Paris. It comes from the Paris series, I think, yeah? And he did those in the mid-'80s. And I think he did them in New York, but was he thinking, did he go back to Paris in the 80s, or was he, do you think, remembering his time in the 50s and 60s?
I mean, the travel to all the other places, I would say, continued through most of his life, too. He was sort of always searching for the light, the things that were different that would inform the work. But I'd also just add, the conversation in the beginning about jazz, and I'd say, there's something, it's not like Dad was a painter that he didn't listen to music as he painted, and he wasn't inspired in that sense. But I think that piece that is like the innovation, and you guys spoke to this, but for me, it's like Dad was always like pushing to find the space for this moment of truth, which is the work, and finding in the limitations of what he was doing, like breaking the assumed boundaries, like the square canvas or the broom or what have you. And I think for him, that jazz, that also is in that space of breaking the boundaries for that moment of innovation, which is such a true American art form and also happens to be a Black art form.
Yeah.
Like that thread, I think he held really, like that's the piece. and also this piece of movement, I think he felt was distinctively American. Like he has some quote about it's like the jets of our time, seeing the rockets lift off. And I think those pieces too are just part of,
Can I quote your dad? Because
Sure, yeah.
I don't think we read this one. Most significantly, in Paris, I was talking to many famous people, artists in particular, but also poets and writers. We were talking about art. We would discuss how realistic painting of the figure is just a duplication of nature. And so no matter how well it was painted, even if it is exactly like what you're copying, it's not the truth. But with my scientific thing, what seemed logical is that the stroke is the truth of it. This was my preoccupation. Then I began to ask myself, what are you really interested in? This is very important right here, the picture of a realistic picture. I began to believe from my conversations with other artists that the real truth is in the stroke. For me, it is large, bold strokes that do not refer distinctly to seen nature. The paint is the subject. The motions of the strokes give the work life. This began to enter my paintings in a very personal way.
Just curious, can you talked a lot about the 60s and that kind of period of his work. Can you characterize, or would you describe any particular shift or evolution that takes place in the later years of Ed Clark's work? I'm just interested in whether you'd make a contrast between work from the 60s or the 70s and 2000s.
I don't know the work well enough to make total pronouncements, but you do see, I think, in the late paintings, a return of the sort of splatter and the brushstroke that you get in the 50s. So in the works that have recently entered the Whitley's collection and second work to enter the Art Institute of Chicago's collection are from the early 50s, early 60s, a kind of real abstract expressionist 10th Street gestural moment before the brushstroke. And then I think in the last years, those sorts of marks return alongside the broom. So you do see splatters and strokes, as well as these sweeps that, as Ivona was saying, produce this sense of velocity. That's one thing. In the 80s, you get these broken rainbow forms. I'm not sure if that's a title or a phrase that he gave. Yes, he gave it, so broken rainbow. That's another thing. That you don't have that format, which he used horizontally and vertically. You don't have that until the mid-80s. So those are two aspects of change. Colours sort of remain quite constant.
I would say so.
There are paintings in the later period that just literally have more paint on them. That I feel like he was able to just innovate in different ways. And it's interesting to even think about, his time in Paris, like the canvas, one of the canvases is a movie screen, and he was happy to have it, just to have, the materials to make the work. So it changes in that way too. And some of the later pieces just are just seeing how the paint just congeals in the, there's just these really rich, lots of paintings for some of those later pieces too.
This is a painting from 2005, which shows a little bit of what we were both saying, the splatters, but then if you look, I'll show you afterwards, but there's the blue paint is very heavily built up and kind of caked and therefore cracked, and obviously the cracks produce a different texture to anything that we're seeing over here. So those are changes in the later years.
That abundance and that lack, I think, is so important, because also in reflecting on those early years, asking like how he managed in Paris, he was very forthright. It's like, I starved. He talks about like just eating oatmeal and that's it, and waiting, using the GI Bill or waiting for a certain amount of money that had come in and eking that out for as long as possible. So I want to go back now and see the late works, because there's definitely something palpable there. And as soon as you said that, that changes the relationship to the abundance of paint on the surface.
In his conversation with Jack Whitten, he talks a lot about American museums ignoring him. Now, if you go to the Whitney, the Art Institute, MoMA, other great museums, you'll always see a work of his in the collection. What do you think he would have made of that?
He'd be delighted to see it. He would still want a solo exhibition at one of those places, and so he would certainly not be satisfied. But yeah, no, he would be thrilled. But the thing about him, I say this all the time, no matter what, sort of all of this is relative, because he was, the most important thing to him, he was able to be an artist and not have to do anything else, and that was hugely successful. But at the same time, he did completely have full visibility of this sort of ignoring by the art world and such. But he was so confident. Like there was no moment where he didn't think that at some point, maybe not in his lifetime, but that the recognition would come, and that these solo exhibitions that still need to come will come. There was no doubt. You can just even tell from the way he did the work, his force of his,
I'm smiling because I love that he was his own favorite artist, and by a long way. So anytime someone asks, like, who's influencing you? He's like, I influence myself. There's always this sense that, like, even other people using the broom, they weren't using the broom I was using. They weren't using it the way I was using it. I'm the best.
I had a great moment just before Christmas. I was in San Francisco to see the Joan Mitchell show, of course, someone hugely important for him. But elsewhere in the museum, in the part of the museum that's devoted to the Fisher collection, there is a painting equally, just at this scale, currently, as you walk into the main room. It's on loan from Pamela Joyner and Fred Giuffrida. It's the Ife Rose, which was made either in or after he got back from Nigeria. And it's the first thing you see as you enter. And it was an amazing moment. Yeah. Well, with that and that kind of invocation of the big show, museum show to come one day, we'll draw it to a close and just thank you all for having us and for this amazing show.